and we are going to start with Martin Renner with Turn Again Consulting. The risk of rodent introductions from shipwrecks to seabirds on Aleutian and Bering Sea Islands.
Thank you, Karen. It's great to be here in Dutch Harbor in Alaska, and thank you for the opportunity to speak here. Can everybody hear me? Great. Oh, okay, I try to do better. So I want to talk about rat spills today. Before I dive too much into that, I'd like to acknowledge my co-authors, Eric Nelson, who's the engineer on the Fish and Wildlife ship Techla, Aaron Poe from the Aleutian Bering Sea Islands Landscape Conservation Cooperative, and Stephen Hess from USGS in Hawaii. I'd also like to thank these individuals for various ways they helped me and really makes this project possible, and funding came from U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service grants, science support grants through USGS. So rat spills, why are they such a big problem? Where should we expect rat spills? Where would they do the most damage, should one occur? And then if you combine those two, we can work out where are seabirds at the greatest risk. And finally, a few words on what we could do about it. So rats have the potential to turn a thriving island ecosystem from this into this, or even worse. This is a cache that presumably a single rat gathered on an island in one winter of least auklets. This is an unusual situation because on this island there are such enormous numbers of birds that they manage to exist despite the presence of rats. What usually happens is that all the birds that are wiped out, it has been estimated that on this island alone, rats kill more birds than the entire Exxon Valdez oil spill killed every year. Normally, there are no birds left. So effectively, you would kill all the birds and all the offsprings every year over and over again until perpetuity or until the rats are somehow removed. So while rat spills are rare events, we still are in a very fortunate situation in Alaska to have a large number of islands that are rat-free, which is somewhat unusual around the world. These islands are real gems, but there always is the threat of an accidental introduction of rats. And one of these events occurred here in Alaska in 1992 when a salvage crew observed rats leaving this vessel. Now, Alaska already had and still has rats on the island. So the situation didn't really get any worse. Now, onto where to expect rats, I built a statistical model using random forests, which is a modeling environment. And I used a database of observed shipwrecks between 1950 and 2014 that was gathered by Eric Nelson out of private interest, and cross-checked with records from the Coast Guard and NOAA. I used aggregated density of fishing traffic, both from satellite, AIS, and VMS data sources that are slightly different but complementary. And then I used aggregated data from the NOAA Fisheries Observer Program on how much fish are actually caught in any particular grid cell as a proxy of the amount of fishing activity. Then I used a bunch of variables that describe the islands, like the the strength of tidal currents near the island, average wind speeds, length of the coastline bathymetry, and a bunch of others. So you let the computer control that, and you find that, well, in hindsight, maybe not that surprising, the amount of fish landings in close proximity to the island is actually the strongest predictor for the frequency of a shipwreck on an island. And this frequency of a shipwreck we use as a proxy then for the likelihood of a rat spill happening. You might recognize that that wreck down here. The next most important variables were strength of the tides, length of the coastline, which immediately makes sense. Longer coastline, this gives a bigger target. Then density of vessel traffic, strength of the winds, average height within 10 kilometers, and so on. And then we can turn this around and apply this model to the existing islands and get an estimated number of how many shipwrecks we should expect per island per 100 years. And we find that islands like Unimac and Unalaska kind of lead the likelihood of a shipwreck. All these really these islands that are most likely to experience shipwrecks are in the eastern Aleutians. It's worth to note. And so the second part of this talk then looks at where are the seabird resources. For here, this talk we just looked at breeding seabirds because they're the only ones using the land. Seabirds that spend their time on sea are not really affected by rat spills. And well, there are plenty of large seabird colonies in the eastern Aleutian Islands, especially puffins. Those really gigantic colonies that go into the millions. They are pretty much restricted to the western Aleutians and Chigulag Island in kind of the west of the eastern Aleutians. Other important large colonies are St. George Island in the Pribilofs, and then Hall and St. Matthew Islands at the edge of the Arctic. So overall, the good news here is that those are kind of complementary images. The most threat is in the east, and the biggest resources are in the west. So when we combine those two, common definition of risk is how likely is an incident multiplied by how severe is an incident. So the worst case is just something that is really bad and likely to happen. That's something you really want to avoid. So if you forget everything else about this talk, if you just, open your eyes for these 2 seconds, this is the slide that I'd like you to remember. This plots on the horizontal x-axis the predicted numbers of shipwrecks per 100 years, against on the vertical y-axis the numbers of seabirds in thousands breeding on an island. And you find in Unalaska pretty high down bottom right with comparatively minuscule amounts of seabirds breeding here, but a fairly high predicted number of shipwrecks, and it's in blue, so it already has rats present. Now the two big islands in terms of risk here are St. George on the Pribilof Islands, which already actually had several times rats killed on the island and mice. It's nothing short of a miracle that this island doesn't have an established rat population. Rats were killed on the dump. There were containers that arrived with mice that were all caught, but this is a tremendous resource that also has a fairly high risk of a rat invasion. And the other one is at the very top here, bull deer with a very high number of birds and a relatively high risk of a rat spill. And we don't have a pointing device here, right? Well, I just freelance this. And so these two islands here, the seabird estimates are fairly conservative. So even if you slide those way up into the millions here, it's still an unfortunate situation that Kiska and Chiguluk, which is reasonably close here, are still very low on the predicted number of shipwrecks. So even if these estimates are off by a factor of 10, they stay in a fairly green to yellow zone of a low risk. Whereas bull deer and St. George just have so much higher likelihood of a shipwreck. If you remember Duck's talk, bull deer is right on that major shipping lane. And in St. George, I come back to that. And yeah, St. George and St. Matthew Islands, they're not really close to major shipping lanes, but St. George has a village, so it gets a fair bit of traffic. And St. Matthew is a bit of an enigma why it has such a high level of shipwrecks predicted and actually observed, but it is in the middle of an intense zone of fishing activity, and with ice retreating further and fishing fleets moving further north, traffic increasing in the Arctic, it could be well possible that St. Matthew would even shift further to the right and more into the red zone here. So in the question then, what can be done about this? The one good thing to do usually is prevention. That's just dollar well spent. Everybody benefits when a vessel is rat-free. There's nothing good about a rat on a vessel. And so anything that can be done to reduce numbers of rats, occurrence of rats on vessels is a good thing. Then the next highest priority should be early response. So you don't want to wait until rats are established, but as soon as a vessel is in trouble, if there's a chance of rats on the island, one has to think about what to do, rats on the vessel, one has to think of what to do to prevent them from getting to the island. There are these rat spill response kits, as Chris Burns told me on the flight over. The rodenticide in these kits that they used to have is expired by now, so this is an important program that might need some reinvigoration. And this is really what has kept rats and mice off the Pribilofs so far. And then, well, last resort is eradication. Eradication is expensive, is usually politically controversial. There has been one successful rat eradication solution so far, formerly called Rat Island, now revert back to the Aleut name, and thank you. That's what I was about to say. So another thing, the last step here I did was using these expected numbers of wrecks and compare them to the area of an island. You wouldn't want to start an eradication campaign, and then find the island to be re-invaded by rats 10 years later. So you would want to have an island that has a large area compared to the likelihood of a reinvasion. So with a large area, you get a big conservation benefit and then a low risk of a failure. And the two islands on the very top here are kind of excluded because they are within swimming distance to other islands that already have rats and have human populations. But then the next two one underneath that, Atu and Kiska, they're both islands that have fairly low predicted numbers of wrecks and have a large area. So if it's feasible to eradicate them, those would be good targets. Islands that have humans on them, the last column there, they're kind of intrinsically so much more difficult because you need to work with rodenticides, and the whole operation might not be impossible, but it will be a lot more complicated. And so the last step, and it's a big one that really drives everything, is just raising awareness, something I'm trying to do here right now, outreach on all levels, and so there's a lot to do here. We've heard a lot of talks about oil spills, and we just, I might skip this, we quickly compare a rat compared to an oil spill that have different geographic scales. For rat spills, obviously island dependent. Typically, a whole island is just affected, often within a year. There have been experimental studies where there's released 2 mice, and within 6 months, the whole island was covered. Not every vessel has rats, obviously, but just about every vessel carries fuel. On the other hand, many islands already have rats. So a rat spill is a fairly rare event, but if they happen, they are so much more catastrophic in the long-term impact. You don't really get dramatic TV footage from a rat spill like you get from a big oil spill. At least the kind of rapid responses that have been done so far are cheap. They're pennies compared to what's spent on oil spills. The long-term effects, well, that's something I think hasn't really been thought about quite as much. An oil spill, the optical signs are gone typically after half a year. If you look really closely, you might find still signs after a decade or 2, maybe even 3 decades. Red Island or Hawada? Hawada. Thank you. I practice this. Red Island was a barren place for 200 years. 200 years, virtually no birds on the island. And all the other islands that are rat-infested on solutions might have a similar or even longer history. So really the take-home message is we need to raise awareness for rat spills. And in conclusion, rat spills are rare, but if they occur, they're catastrophic. Nearshore fishing activities is the most important predictor for rats. St. George and Buldia Islands are the ones most at risk. Prevention and early response are wise investments. More work is needed, but Atu and Kiska Island appear to offer good returns for eradication efforts, and we need more awareness, we need outreach, and we need funding for work on rat spills. So thank you so much.